My name is Rowena Lane. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, people have described me using the same three words: calm, reliable, and quiet. Not quite in a timid way. Quiet in the way someone becomes when they've spent years listening more than speaking, noticing things other people miss, remembering details that don't seem important until much later. I live in a coastal town outside Brighton, England, where the sea air carries a strange kind of honesty. It has a way of making ordinary life feel reflective. Maybe that's why I've always preferred routines. Morning tea by the window, long walks along the promenade, the quiet rhythm of a predictable life. For 16 years, I was married. From the outside, my marriage looked steady. No dramatic fights, no broken plates or late-night screaming matches. We were the kind of couple people pointed to when they talked about stability. We paid our bills on time. We hosted polite dinners. We smiled in photographs. And if you had asked anyone who knew us, even our closest friends, they would have told you that my husband and I had built something dependable together, which, for a long time, I believed too. But this story didn't begin with suspicion. It didn't begin with jealousy or betrayal, or some moment of explosive discovery that shattered everything in an instant. It began with something much smaller. An old email account, one I didn't even know still existed. I found it completely by accident one evening while trying to recover a forgotten password connected to an old subscription. The account belonged to my husband, an address he had apparently stopped using years ago. At least, that's what I thought. Curiosity wasn't my intention. I wasn't searching for secrets. In fact, I almost logged out the moment the inbox opened. But then I noticed something strange. Messages from our first year of marriage. Not bills, not automated receipts, not work correspondence. Conversations. Long ones. The kind people only write when they believe the person on the other side truly understands them. And as I read them, slowly, quietly, over the course of several evenings, I realized something that unsettled me far more than anger ever could. The memories I had carried about the beginning of our marriage, were they not the same memories he had been sharing with someone else? What I discovered didn't lead to shouting, or dramatic confrontations, or revenge. Instead, it changed something deeper. It changed how I understood the role I had been playing for years, without ever realizing it. And once you see something like that clearly, you can't pretend you don't. So this story isn't about catching someone. It's about what happens when you quietly realize that the foundation of your life was built on a version of events you never questioned, and what you choose to do once you finally understand the truth. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever discovered something small, almost accidental, that slowly changed the way you saw an entire chapter of your life? For most of my adult life, people believed they understood exactly who I was. Not in a cruel way, just in a convenient one. I was the calm one, the dependable one, the woman who remembered birthdays, organized travel plans, and quietly handled the small things that make life run smoothly. If there was a dinner to coordinate, I did it. If someone forgot a detail, I filled in the gap without drawing attention to it. My husband, Daniel, used to joke about it with our friends. "Rowena remembers everything," he'd say, smiling. Honestly, I'd forget my own schedule if she didn't keep things straight. Everyone would laugh. I usually did too, because on the surface, it sounded like appreciation. But over the years, I started noticing something subtle beneath comments like that. When people described Daniel, they used words like driven, ambitious, and charismatic. He was the one who spoke confidently in conversations, the one who told stories at the dinner table, the one who filled silence with easy charm. When people described me, it was always supportive. "Daniel's lucky to have you keeping him grounded. You're so patient with him. You're the organized one, right?" It was never unkind. In fact, most of it was meant as praise. But slowly, almost invisibly, a pattern formed. Daniel was the main character of our shared life, and I was the steady background that helped the story make sense. At first, I didn't question it. When we married, I was 22, and he was 24. We were young enough that the future still felt like something we were building together, rather than something already defined. In those early years, I believed our roles were simply different, not unequal. Daniel thrived in crowded rooms. He loved the energy of work events, long debates with friends, and the thrill of new opportunities. I preferred quiet spaces, books, long conversations with one person rather than 10. It felt balanced. He moved the world forward. I made sure the world didn't fall apart behind us. And for a long time, that arrangement seemed to work. When Daniel stayed late at the office during the first few years of his career, I told myself it was temporary. When he forgot things, anniversaries, small promises, conversations we had already had, I assumed it was just the way his mind worked. Some people live in detail. Others live in motion. I told myself that both kinds of people were necessary. What I didn't notice then was how quietly the definitions around me were hardening. At family gatherings, Daniel was the one everyone asked about his work. What's the company planning next? Sai nai some. How's the promotion track looking? What's the next big project? When someone asked me about my life, it was usually framed differently. How's Daniel handling the pressure? Are you keeping him organized? Is he still working those long hours? I rarely corrected anyone, not because I lacked answers, but because it felt easier to let the conversation flow where it naturally wanted to go. Over time, people stopped asking certain questions entirely. They didn't ask about my writing work. They didn't ask about the university classes I had started teaching part-time. They didn't ask what I thought about the decisions Daniel was making that affected both of us. None of it happened dramatically. There was no single moment where someone declared that my role was smaller. Instead, it happened the way fog rolls in from the sea outside Brighton. Slowly, quietly, until the entire landscape looks different without anyone remembering exactly when the shift began. I became the person who kept things stable, reliable, predictable, invisible in the most comfortable way possible. And the strange thing is, I accepted that version of myself for years. Not because I believed I was less important, but because I believed that someone had to hold the quiet parts of a life together. What I didn't understand yet was that the way people see you, especially the people closest to you, slowly shapes the way they treat you. And sometimes, they start believing that the quiet person in the room isn't paying attention at all, that she isn't noticing the details, that she isn't remembering the things everyone else forgets. But I was noticing. I was always noticing. Even then. Looking back now, I can see that the first real fracture in our marriage wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no betrayal, no moment where something clearly broke. Instead, it was something so small that, at the time, I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. It was during our first year of marriage. Daniel had just started a new position at a marketing firm in London, and we had been invited to one of those early networking dinners, the kind where everyone is trying to appear more confident than they actually feel. The restaurant was crowded and loud, full of people balancing wine glasses while discussing projects, promotions, and future plans. I remember feeling slightly out of place, not uncomfortable exactly, just aware that this wasn't my natural environment. Daniel, on the other hand, moved through the room as if he had always belonged there. He introduced me to colleagues, managers, and people whose names I quickly forgot because they were introduced in quick succession. Rowena, this is Martin. He runs the analytics team. Rowena, meet Clara from strategy. Otis. Each introduction was polite, brief, and followed by the same friendly smile. And then, at one point during the evening, something happened that stayed with me far longer than I expected. We were standing near the bar talking with two of Daniel's coworkers, Martin and a woman named Elise. The conversation drifted toward a campaign Daniel's team was working on. Martin mentioned a problem they were having with the messaging strategy. Daniel laughed and said something like, We're still trying to figure out how to simplify it. Basamatse. Without really thinking, I offered a small suggestion. It wasn't anything groundbreaking, just a thought about framing the campaign around one clear idea instead of three competing ones. I had spent years editing, writing, and helping students clarify arguments, so simplifying complex messages came naturally to me. Martin paused. Elise nodded thoughtfully, and for a moment, it looked like they were actually considering what I had said. Then Daniel laughed again. Not unkindly, just lightly, the way someone dismisses a comment without making it obvious. Rowena always likes to simplify things, he said, placing a hand briefly on my shoulder. But marketing isn't quite that straightforward. And that's gamainen. The conversation moved on immediately. Martin started talking about another project. Elise asked Daniel a follow-up question. No one said anything cruel. No one even looked uncomfortable. But I remember standing there, holding my glass, feeling something quiet settle in my chest. Not embarrassment. Something more subtle than that. Recognition. Because Daniel hadn't just disagreed with me. He had gently repositioned me in the conversation. Not as someone contributing an idea, but as someone whose perspective didn't really belong in that room. And the strange thing is, I didn't react. I smiled. I nodded. I even laughed softly, as if I agreed with him. That's the part I thought about later. Not what Daniel said, but how quickly I accepted it. How easily I stepped back into the role that had already been forming around me. The supportive wife. The listener. The person who stood slightly behind the conversation rather than inside it. The rest of the evening continued normally. We talked to more people. We finished dinner. On the train ride home, Daniel chatted about how promising the campaign might be and how impressed his manager seemed. I listened, just like I always did. And I told myself the same thing people often say when a moment feels slightly uncomfortable but not serious enough to challenge. It was nothing. It didn't matter. He probably didn't even realize what he said. But what I didn't admit, even to myself, was that a small part of me had quietly filed that moment away. Not as an argument, not as a grievance, just as information. Because sometimes the first small cut isn't painful. It's simply the moment you begin to understand the shape of the blade. The strange thing about subtle moments of dismissal is that they rarely arrive alone. They repeat. Not loudly, not obviously, but often enough that you begin to adjust yourself around them. After that dinner, life continued the way it always had. Daniel's career kept gaining momentum. New projects, new responsibilities, more late evenings at the office. I continued my freelance editing work and the occasional teaching assignment at the university. From the outside, everything looked steady, and yet, small patterns were quietly forming. At dinner parties with friends, Daniel would sometimes retell stories about our lives. Vacations we had taken, decisions we had made together, challenges we had navigated early in our marriage. But the stories were always slightly different from the way I remembered them. In his versions, the turning points usually came from his ideas, his initiative, his instincts, and I would listen, occasionally surprised by how neatly the narrative centered around him. For example, when we decided to move closer to Brighton after our second year of marriage, Daniel often told people it was because he wanted a quieter place to focus on building his career. What he didn't usually mention was that the idea had originally come from me. I had suggested it after noticing how exhausted he was from commuting and late nights in London. I had researched neighborhoods, rental options, and even transportation schedules. None of that bothered me at first. Marriage, after all, is often a shared story told from different perspectives. But slowly, I began noticing something else. Whenever I added a detail, something small that corrected the timeline or clarified how a decision had actually happened, Daniel would smile and gently redirect the conversation. "Rowena remembers the details better than I do," he would say. And everyone would laugh again. The comment sounded complimentary, but it had a quiet effect. It turned my corrections into something trivial, not insights, just the harmless observations of someone who pays attention to minor things. Over time, I started speaking less during those stories, not out of resentment. Just because I could see the rhythm of the conversation didn't really require my version of events. And Daniel seemed comfortable with that rhythm. Sometimes he would even speak for me in group settings. If someone asked a question about something we had done together, our travel plans, home renovations, even financial decisions, he would answer before I had a chance to respond. "Rowena prefers quieter trips," he might say. "Rowena isn't really interested in that kind of thing." The odd part was that occasionally those statements were only partially true. I did enjoy quiet travel, but that didn't mean I disliked adventure. I appreciated structure, but that didn't mean I avoided risk. Still, I rarely corrected him, because each individual moment seemed too small to challenge. It's difficult to interrupt a conversation just to say, "Actually, that's not quite accurate." So instead, I adjusted. When Daniel answered for me, I nodded. When he summarized my preferences, I smiled. When he retold stories where his role seemed slightly larger than I remembered, I stayed quiet. And with each passing year, something subtle happened. Daniel became more confident speaking about me, while I became more comfortable allowing him to. It wasn't manipulation, at least not in the obvious sense. It was simply what happens when one person fills the silence quickly, and the other person learns that letting them do it keeps everything smooth, peaceful, predictable. The life we had built depended, in many ways, on that predictability. Friends admired how calm our marriage seemed. There were no public disagreements, no dramatic confrontations. We looked like a couple who had mastered the art of understanding each other without conflict. But what no one noticed, not even Daniel, I suspect, was that understanding can sometimes turn into assumption, and assumption, over time, can quietly replace curiosity. Daniel stopped asking what I thought about certain things, not because he didn't care, but because he believed he already knew. And I had allowed that belief to grow for so long that correcting it began to feel unnecessary. Until much later, when I realized something important. When people become used to speaking for you, they eventually stop wondering what you might say for yourself. There is a moment in many long relationships when you begin to understand the role everyone quietly expects you to play. Not the role you consciously chose, the one that formed around you because it made life easier for everyone else. For me, that realization didn't arrive all at once. It emerged slowly, through ordinary routines. By our 5th year of marriage, Daniel's career had accelerated in a way that required more attention than ever. Promotions meant longer hours, more travel, and more responsibility. From the outside, it looked impressive. From inside the marriage, it created a new balance, one that no one explicitly discussed, but everyone seemed to accept. Daniel became the visible half of our lives. I became the infrastructure. I handled the household details. Bills, appointments, repairs, family schedules. If Daniel needed to travel suddenly, I rearranged things without making it complicated. If a dinner had to be hosted for his colleagues, I planned it. If a family event conflicted with his work, I explained his absence. None of these tasks felt unfair individually. In fact, I was good at them. Organization and observation had always been my strengths. But gradually, I began noticing how predictable my position had become. When Daniel's friends visited, they greeted him first, naturally. Conversations started with his latest project or business trip. Eventually, someone would turn to me and say something warm but familiar. "Rowena, you always make everything run so smoothly. You must be the one keeping Daniel sane. You're the reliable one." Reliable. The word followed me everywhere. It sounded kind, but it also carried an assumption. Reliable people don't surprise you. They don't disrupt the structure of things. They keep systems functioning quietly in the background. One evening, that reality became clearer than it ever had before. Daniel was hosting a small gathering at our house. 3 colleagues and their partners. The kind of casual dinner where everyone talks about work while pretending not to. I had prepared most of the meal earlier in the afternoon. By the time everyone arrived, the house felt warm, calm, and ready. The conversation drifted between business topics and personal stories. At one point, one of Daniel's colleagues asked him a question. "How do you manage everything with your schedule? The travel, the deadlines, all of it?" Daniel smiled and gestured casually in my direction. "Oh, that part's easy," he said. "Rowena takes care of the rest of life so I can focus on work." Everyone laughed. Someone raised their glass and said something like, "Every successful man needs a Rowena." The comment was meant as praise, but something about the phrasing stayed with me. Not because it sounded insulting, because it sounded definitive. A Rowena. Not a partner. Not a person with her own direction. Just a reliable support structure that made someone else's life possible. And the strange thing is, no one in that room meant anything negative by it. They were describing the pattern they saw, the one I had quietly maintained for years. Daniel looked genuinely appreciative when he said it. Proud, even. He believed he was acknowledging my contribution. And in a way, he was. But contributions can become identities if you're not careful. That evening, as I cleared the dishes after everyone left, I realized something subtle but important. The role I had been assigned in our shared story was no longer temporary. It had become permanent in everyone's mind. Daniel's, our friends, even, perhaps, my own. Reliable, supportive, useful, invisible in the most comfortable way. And once people become comfortable with a role like that, they rarely imagine the person inside it might one day decide to step out. For years, nothing about my life felt urgent enough to question. That might sound strange, but comfort has a way of softening curiosity. When everything appears stable, when the bills are paid, the routines work, and the house is quiet at night, you stop examining the structure holding it all together. You simply live inside it. But change rarely begins with a dramatic revelation. Sometimes it begins with a single, quiet moment where something ordinary suddenly feels different. For me, that moment happened on a Tuesday afternoon. There was nothing remarkable about the day itself. The sky over Brighton was gray in the way it often is during early spring, and the air carried that damp sea breeze that makes everything feel slightly muted. Daniel was at work, of course. He had left early that morning after a quick cup of coffee and a distracted goodbye. Something about a meeting he didn't want to be late for. The house was silent by midday. I was sitting at the small desk near the living room window, reviewing an essay for one of my university students. The assignment was about narrative voice, how people tell the story of their own lives. One of the questions I had written in the margin of the student's paper was simple. Who gets to decide which parts of the story matter? I remember staring at that sentence longer than necessary. Not because of the essay, because something about the question felt oddly personal. I closed the document, leaned back in the chair, and looked around the room. 16 years of life were contained in that house. The framed photographs on the wall, the bookshelves we had filled together, the small details that quietly accumulate when two people build a life side by side. And yet, as I sat there, a thought surfaced that I had never quite allowed myself to examine before. If someone else told the story of our marriage, whose voice would they use? The answer came surprisingly quickly. Daniel's. Not because he had intentionally taken control of the narrative, but because he had always been the one speaking the most. The one explaining things to friends, colleagues, and even family. The one whose version of events naturally filled the room first. And I had spent so many years listening that my own perspective had slowly become secondary. That realization wasn't painful. It was simply clarifying, like adjusting the focus of a camera and suddenly seeing the full shape of something that had always been slightly blurred. I stood up and walked toward the bookshelf near the hallway. On the lower shelf was a small leather notebook I had been using for years. It wasn't a diary exactly, more like a place where I wrote observations, fragments of conversations, and ideas for essays. I picked it up and flipped through a few pages. There were notes about ordinary things, comments Daniel had made during trips, little moments from family gatherings. Nothing dramatic, just details. And as I read through them, something interesting became clear. My memory of our life, recorded in those quiet notes, contained layers that were missing from the stories Daniel usually told. The motivations behind decisions, the conversations that happened before turning points, the subtle tensions that no one else noticed. For the first time, I understood something important. I hadn't been invisible all those years. I had simply been observing, watching how the story of our marriage was told, and how it slowly drifted away from the fuller version I remembered. That afternoon, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't make any declarations or sudden decisions. I just placed the notebook back on the shelf and returned to my desk. But something inside me had shifted. Not anger, not resentment, just awareness. And awareness, once it settles into your mind, has a quiet way of changing everything that comes after. Because when you finally realize that the story you've been living has more than one narrator, you start paying closer attention to the chapters that haven't been written yet. After that afternoon, nothing about my behavior changed dramatically. From the outside, I was still the same person everyone had always known. I hosted dinners when Daniel needed them. I answered messages from family members. I continued teaching my small university seminars and editing manuscripts for clients. The structure of my days looked exactly the same. But internally, something subtle had shifted. Before, my quietness had been instinctive. Now, it was intentional. I began listening differently. When Daniel told stories at dinner with friends, I noticed not just what he said, but what he left out. When he summarized decisions we had made together, I paid attention to how the narrative framed those choices. Sometimes he described things as though they had happened naturally, without much discussion. Sometimes he spoke as if certain ideas had always been his. None of it sounded dishonest in an obvious way, but it revealed something about how he understood our shared life. In Daniel's version of events, I was always present, just slightly behind the main action. And the more I observed this pattern, the less I felt the need to interrupt it. That might sound passive, but it wasn't. It was simply a decision to stop correcting the story in small ways. Instead, I started noticing the larger structure of it. For example, Daniel often assumed I agreed with decisions before we had actually discussed them. If he mentioned the possibility of a new project that might require travel, he would casually say something like, "You won't mind if things get busy for a few weeks." Not a question, a statement. And before, I would have immediately reassured him, "Of course, I don't mind. We'll make it work." But now I simply listened. Sometimes I nodded. Sometimes I said nothing at all. And that silence had an interesting effect. Daniel interpreted it exactly the way most people interpret silence, as an agreement, which meant he continued speaking confidently about plans, schedules, and priorities that shaped both of our lives. Meanwhile, I began paying closer attention to details I had previously overlooked. Financial documents, travel patterns. Daniel handled small administrative decisions that Daniel handled automatically. Not because I suspected anything wrong, but because understanding the full structure of our life suddenly felt important. One evening, I noticed something else. Daniel had always maintained several email accounts for different parts of his work: professional correspondence, marketing newsletters, and subscriptions connected to projects. Most of them were used actively, but occasionally, he mentioned an older address he had stopped using years ago. "I think that account still exists somewhere," he said once, half laughing. "I probably couldn't even remember the password if I tried." I At the time, I barely registered the comment. It sounded like one of those small technological leftovers everyone accumulates over the years. An old account, an unused login, a digital space abandoned and forgotten. But after that conversation, the idea stayed somewhere in the back of my mind. Not as a suspicion, just as a detail. And once you begin noticing details like that, something interesting happens. Your silence becomes productive. While other people assume you are disengaged, you are actually gathering information quietly, learning how the systems around you function, understanding the patterns that shape everyday life. Daniel, of course, noticed none of this. Why would he? From his perspective, nothing had changed. His quiet, dependable wife was still managing the house, still listening during conversations, still allowing him to lead the narrative of their shared life. He saw the same calm expression he had always seen, the same steady presence. What he didn't realize was that silence can serve two very different purposes. Sometimes it keeps the peace. Other times, it prepares you to understand the truth of something without anyone realizing you're looking for it. One of the advantages of being underestimated is that people stop watching you closely. They assume they already understand who you are. Once that assumption settles in, you gain something most people rarely experience: freedom to observe without interference. That was the quiet position I had occupied in our marriage for years, though I hadn't fully understood its value until recently. From Daniel's perspective, I was still the same person I had always been: reliable, calm, uninterested in the complicated mechanics of his professional life. He never hid anything from me, but he also never imagined I might be paying close attention to the structures around him. For example, finances. Daniel had always been the one who handled most of the long-term financial planning: investments, retirement accounts, tax arrangements. It was something he enjoyed managing. Early in our marriage, I had trusted that system without much involvement. Partly because I believed it worked. Partly because Daniel seemed confident doing it. But once I started observing more carefully, I realized how little I actually knew about the full picture. Not because Daniel was secretive, simply because I had never asked to see it. One quiet Saturday morning, I opened the cabinet where we kept our household documents. Mortgage papers, insurance policies, bank statements. Everything was neatly organized in labeled folders, exactly the way Daniel preferred. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and began reading through them, not searching for anything alarming, just familiarizing myself with details that had previously seemed unnecessary to know. Account numbers, dates, investment funds. Gradually, the architecture of our shared finances became clearer. Nothing appeared suspicious. If anything, Daniel had managed things responsibly, but understanding those systems gave me something new: independence of knowledge. Later that week, I opened a small savings account in my own name, not secretly exactly, just quietly. The amount I placed into it wasn't dramatic: a portion of freelance payments that previously would have flowed directly into our joint account. It was a practical step, nothing more. The kind of thing many people do without attaching deeper meaning to it. But for me, it represented something different. Awareness becomes action. At the same time, I continued documenting small things in my notebook. Not emotional reactions. Facts. Dates of conversations. Decisions Daniel described as spontaneous that I remembered differently. Comments he made, casual comments about work relationships or old friends. None of those notes seemed important individually, but patterns only reveal themselves when you step back and look at many details together. Daniel never noticed the notebook. Why would he? It had been part of my routine for years. From his perspective, it probably contained teaching notes or fragments of writing ideas. which, to be fair, it often did. But slowly, those pages also became something else. A quiet record of how our shared story was actually unfolding. Meanwhile, our social circle continued seeing the same version of me they had always known. At gatherings, people still describe me the same way. Rowena keeps everything balanced. Rowena is so calm about things. You're lucky to have someone so steady. Daniel would smile proudly when they said those things. And I realized something interesting about that pride. He genuinely believed he appreciated me. He saw my stability as a strength. What he didn't realize was that stability and invisibility can sometimes look identical from the outside. One evening during dinner with friends, someone asked Daniel about a recent project his company was launching. He spoke for several minutes, explaining the strategy, the timelines, and the potential impact. Everyone listened attentively. At one point, Daniel turned toward me and said lightly, "Rowena probably thinks I talk about work too much." Everyone laughed again. I smiled, the same calm expression I had worn for years. But inside, I was noticing something. Not about Daniel, about myself. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't listening to these conversations as a participant trying to keep the peace. I was listening as an observer. Someone quietly mapping the landscape of her own life. And the more clearly I understood that landscape, the more prepared I felt for whatever might eventually emerge from it. Because understanding isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with raised voices or sudden confrontations. It builds slowly, detail by detail, piece by piece, until one day you realize that you know far more about your life than anyone ever assumed you did, including the person who has been telling the story alongside you. The discovery itself happened on an evening so ordinary that, for a long time afterward, it felt strange that such a small moment could reshape the way I understood 16 years of my life. Daniel was away for 2 days on a work trip to Manchester. The house was quiet in that familiar way it often became when he traveled. Dishes already done, the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway, the distant sound of cars passing along the wet street outside. I had been trying to reset a password for an online subscription connected to one of Daniel's old devices. It was something mundane. A software service he had used years ago that was still charging a small annual fee. When I attempted to log in, the system asked me to verify the account through an older email address. One I didn't immediately recognize. But when I looked more closely, I realized it was an address Daniel had created years before we married. I almost stopped there. Old accounts rarely contain anything interesting. Most become digital storage rooms filled with outdated newsletters and forgotten notifications. Still, curiosity has a gentle way of extending small tasks. So I followed the password recovery process. The login worked on the first attempt. And suddenly I was looking at an inbox that hadn't been opened in years. At first, it looked exactly as I expected. Promotional messages, old confirmations, receipts from long-expired subscriptions. I was about to log out when something caught my attention. A series of emails from the same sender, dated during the first year of our marriage. The subject lines were conversational, not professional, not automated, just names and fragments of sentences. I hesitated for a moment, not because I felt guilty about reading them, but because something about the pattern made me pause. There were dozens of messages, some short, some long, spread across several months. Eventually, curiosity won. I opened the earliest one. The message itself wasn't dramatic. It read like a casual update between friends. Daniel describing his new job, the adjustments of married life, and the stress of commuting between London and Brighton. But as I read further into the exchange, I noticed something unusual. The tone. It was reflective in a way Daniel rarely sounded during our conversations at home. More candid, more analytical. The person writing back, someone named Claire, responded with thoughtful questions and long replies of her own. Their conversations weren't flirtatious. They weren't obviously romantic, but they were intimate in a different sense. They were discussing Daniel's thoughts about marriage, about responsibility, about the future he imagined for himself. And the strange part wasn't that he was sharing those thoughts with someone else. People talk to friends about their lives all the time. What unsettled me was something quieter. The version of our early marriage that Daniel described in those messages didn't fully match the one I remembered living. In his emails, he often described feeling uncertain about settling down so young. He talked about pressure, from family, from expectations, from the idea that marriage was the logical next step. In one message, he wrote something that made me stop reading for a moment. "Rowena is wonderful," he had said. "She makes life stable in ways I probably need more than I admit. But sometimes I wonder if stability is something you grow into, or something you accept because it's the sensible choice." I read that sentence 3 times. Not because it sounded cruel, because it sounded honest. And honesty, when discovered years later, can feel strangely disorienting. Over the next few evenings, I read the rest of the messages slowly. There was no secret affair revealed, no dramatic confession, just a long series of thoughtful conversations Daniel had apparently needed during that first year of our marriage. Conversations where he examined doubts, ambitions, frustrations, things he had never spoken about directly with me. Claire, whoever she was, seemed to serve as a kind of sounding board. Someone who asked questions that encouraged Daniel to articulate thoughts he hadn't fully resolved. And as I finished reading the final email in the thread, I realized something important. The discovery didn't make me angry. It made me clear. Because those messages revealed a version of Daniel I had never fully seen. Not dishonest, just uncertain in ways he had kept separate from the life we were building together. And once I understood that version of him, something about the last 16 years suddenly looked different. Not worse, just more complete. For several days after reading those emails, I didn't do anything. Not because I didn't know what they meant, but because understanding something and deciding what to do with that understanding are 2 very different processes. The house was quiet during that week. Daniel returned from Manchester, resumed his normal routine, and spoke about work in the same relaxed tone he always used. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, I was standing at a crossroads I hadn't expected to find. There were several ways I could respond to what I had discovered. The most obvious one was confrontation. I could sit Daniel down at the kitchen table and tell him exactly what I had found. I could ask questions. I could demand explanations for conversations he had never mentioned. Many people would have chosen that path immediately. It would have been understandable. But the more I considered it, the more I realized something important. Those emails weren't evidence of betrayal. They were evidence of perspective. Daniel had been honest with someone else about feelings he hadn't known how to express inside our marriage. 16 years later, bringing those conversations into the present as accusations would change very little. They belonged to a different version of us. Another option was simpler. I could ignore the discovery entirely, close the account, let the information settle quietly in the past where it technically belonged. That path would have been easy. But it would also require pretending that the knowledge hadn't shifted something fundamental in my understanding of our relationship. And I had already reached a point where pretending felt unnecessary. There was a third option, though. Not dramatic, not confrontational, just deliberate. Instead of reacting to what I had learned, I could treat it as information about the deeper structure of our marriage. Daniel had entered that first year uncertain about stability. He had quietly framed me, even then, as the person who provided it. And over the years, that interpretation had shaped the roles we both ended up playing. He became the one moving forward, exploring possibilities, taking risks. I became the foundation that allowed him to do those things safely. Neither of us had formally agreed to that arrangement. But the emails made something clear. Daniel had always believed that stability came from me, which meant something interesting. If the stability changed, the entire structure of our life might shift in ways he had never considered. That realization wasn't about punishment. It was about balance. For years, I had allowed the narrative of our marriage to form around the idea that my role was simply to support the larger story. Now I understood that my presence had been shaping the story all along, just quietly. The question wasn't whether I had influence, it was how consciously I wanted to use it. So I made a decision. Not to confront Daniel immediately, not to reveal what I had discovered. Instead, I would begin something simpler. I would stop reinforcing the version of our life that placed me permanently in the background. No announcements, no dramatic conversations, just small adjustments in how I participated in the structure we had built together. Because sometimes the most irreversible decisions are not the ones announced out loud. They are the quiet commitments you make to yourself when you realize you no longer need to play the role everyone has grown comfortable with. And once that kind of decision settles in your mind, the next steps tend to unfold naturally. Once the decision was made, the changes began quietly, not in ways anyone around me would immediately recognize. That was intentional. Dramatic shifts attract attention. They invite questions, resistance, and sometimes even conflict. What I was doing required something different. Subtlety. The first change was internal. For years, I had automatically structured my days around Daniel's schedule. If he traveled, I adjusted. If he worked late, dinner moved later. If he needed quiet to prepare for meetings, the house adapted. None of those habits disappeared overnight. But I stopped treating them as fixed priorities. If I had a class to prepare or a client deadline approaching, I didn't rearrange my time quite as quickly. If Daniel mentioned a last-minute work dinner, I simply wished him a good evening instead of reorganizing the rest of the night around his absence. He didn't seem to notice at first. Why would he? From his perspective, everything still looked orderly. But underneath that surface, I was gradually recentering my life around my own rhythm instead of his. The second change involved practical matters. Over the years, Daniel had handled most of our long-term financial decisions. Investments, retirement planning, tax documents. It was a system that worked efficiently because one person maintained it. Now that I understood the structure more clearly, I began participating in it differently. Not by questioning his choices, simply by becoming present in the conversations. One evening after dinner, I asked if we could review our accounts together sometime during the weekend. Daniel looked mildly surprised, though not suspicious. "Of course," he said easily. "It's not very exciting stuff, but if you're curious, we can go through it." Eh. The word curious made me smile. That was exactly how I wanted it to appear. Just curiosity. During that conversation, a few days later, I asked practical questions. Where certain investments were located, how our savings were divided, which accounts were joint and which were individual. Daniel answered everything comfortably. If anything, he seemed pleased that I was taking an interest in something he had always managed alone. To him, it probably looked like a small step towards shared responsibility. What he didn't realize was that understanding those systems gave me something more important than involvement. It gave me clarity. At the same time, I continued expanding parts of my own life that had once felt secondary. My university teaching hours increased slightly. A publishing client offered a longer editing contract, which I accepted without checking Daniel's travel calendar first. Again, none of this appeared dramatic, but it quietly shifted the balance of how my time and energy were distributed. And the interesting thing about balance is that it rarely announces when it changes. It simply begins to feel different. One evening, Daniel mentioned an upcoming work conference that might require him to travel abroad for 2 weeks. In the past, my response would have been immediate reassurance. "We'll manage. Don't worry about things here." This time, I paused. Not deliberately. Just long enough to consider my own schedule. I may have classes during part of that time, I said calmly. But we'll figure it out. Daniel nodded, already moving on to another topic. He didn't hear anything unusual in my reply. But I did. For the first time in years, the logistics of our shared life weren't automatically aligning themselves around one person's plans. They were becoming mutual considerations. And Daniel, accustomed to the old structure, didn't yet recognize the quiet shift taking place. Because when someone has spent years believing that stability is permanent, they rarely notice the moment it begins to move. The first signs appeared so gradually that Daniel didn't recognize them as consequences. To him, they probably felt like small inconveniences. Nothing more. But systems that have operated smoothly for years develop a certain rhythm. When that rhythm changes, even slightly, the difference becomes noticeable over time. The first moment came during one of Daniel's busy weeks. He had several late meetings and a presentation he was preparing for a client. Normally, evenings like that followed a familiar pattern. Dinner would be ready when he arrived home, the house quiet, the small logistical details of life already handled. But that Thursday evening, I was still working when he walked through the door. Papers were spread across the dining table. My laptop was open, and several books were stacked beside it. Daniel paused in the doorway for a second, clearly surprised. "Busy night?" he asked. "Just finishing a few things for class tomorrow," I replied, glancing up briefly before returning to the document I was editing. He nodded and loosened his tie, moving toward the kitchen. Nothing about the moment felt tense, but there was a quiet difference. For the first time in years, Daniel had to open the refrigerator and decide what to make for himself. He handled it easily enough. Some toast, eggs, a quick meal. Still, I noticed the subtle way he glanced toward the dining table once or twice, as if expecting the familiar routine to reappear. It didn't. That kind of small shift repeated itself in other places. When Daniel mentioned social plans with colleagues, I sometimes declined if they conflicted with my own commitments. Not abruptly, just calmly. "I have something scheduled that evening," I would say. "Maybe next time." Again, he accepted those answers without complaint, but I could see the slight hesitation that followed them. For years, I had rarely been unavailable. The structure of our shared life had quietly relied on that availability. Now that it wasn't automatic, Daniel occasionally had to adjust his expectations in ways he wasn't used to. The most noticeable change, though, appeared in our conversations. Daniel still spoke about work the way he always had, explaining projects, describing office dynamics, occasionally venting about deadlines. But I listened differently, not less attentively, just less predictably. Instead of immediately reassuring him or offering the supportive comments he had come to expect, I sometimes asked questions. Real ones. "Do you enjoy that part of the job?" I asked one evening after he described a particularly demanding project. Daniel paused, slightly surprised. "I suppose so," he said. "Why?" I shrugged lightly. "Just wondering." The conversation moved on, but moments like that accumulated quietly. Questions about decisions, curiosity about plans, occasional pauses where my response wasn't the automatic encouragement he had grown accustomed to hearing. None of it sounded confrontational, but it introduced something new into the dynamic between us. Uncertainty. And uncertainty, even in small amounts, changes how people perceive stability. A few weeks later, Daniel mentioned something interesting during dinner. "You seem busier lately," he said casually. I looked up from my plate. "Do I?" "A little," he replied. "Not in a bad way, just different." I smiled gently. "I suppose I've been focusing on a few things I put aside before." "See?" He nodded slowly, accepting the explanation, but I could tell he was thinking about it. Because when someone has relied on a certain structure for years, even small adjustments begin to register eventually. not as problems, just changes. And change, once it begins to accumulate, has a quiet way of revealing how much the old balance depended on one person remaining exactly where everyone expected them to be. It took several months before Daniel began to sense that something deeper had shifted, not because the changes were hidden, but because they were gradual enough to blend into everyday life. At first, he responded to them the way most people respond to minor disruptions, by assuming they were temporary. If I was busy one evening, it must be because of a deadline. If I declined a social invitation, it must be because I was tired. If our routines felt slightly less synchronized than before, it must be one of those phases couples occasionally pass through. That explanation worked for a while, but patterns revealed themselves eventually. One evening in early autumn, Daniel came home earlier than usual. The air outside carried that crisp coolness that appears just before winter begins settling into the coast. I was in the living room, reviewing notes for an upcoming lecture. When he walked in, he lingered near the doorway instead of heading straight to the kitchen the way he normally did. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. The tone of his voice wasn't urgent, just thoughtful. I closed my notebook. "Of course." He sat down across from me, leaning forward slightly as if organizing his thoughts before speaking. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said. I waited. "Have I done something to upset you recently?" The question hung in the room for a moment. Not dramatic, just sincere. I considered my answer carefully. "No," I said calmly. "Why would you think that?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "Things just feel different." Different. The word carried more weight than he probably intended, because he was right. Things were different, but not in the way people usually imagine when they suspect something is wrong in a marriage. There had been no arguments, no accusations, no emotional confrontations that might clearly explain the shift he was sensing. Instead, what Daniel was feeling was something far more subtle. Distance created by independence. The kind that grows when two people slowly stop orbiting around the same center. "I've just been focusing on some things I neglected before," I said gently. "Work, classes, a few personal projects." Daniel nodded, though his expression suggested the explanation didn't fully settle his curiosity. "I guess I'm just used to us operating a certain way," he said. There it was, the quiet acknowledgement of the structure that had existed for years. The one where my stability supported the rhythm of his life so consistently that it had come to feel permanent. I offered a small smile. "People change over time," I said. The comment sounded simple, almost obvious. But something about it made Daniel lean back in his chair, absorbing the idea more carefully than I expected. Because sometimes the most unsettling realization in a long relationship isn't that someone is angry. It's that they've simply moved forward. Not away from you, just forward in a direction that no longer depends on the same assumptions. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't push the conversation further, but I could see the quiet uncertainty in his eyes. He was beginning to notice that the version of our marriage he had always relied on, the one where stability came effortlessly from my presence, was slowly evolving into something less predictable. And by the time someone notices that kind of shift clearly, the process of creating it has been happening for a long time, which means reversing it isn't as simple as asking what went wrong. Because nothing had gone wrong. The structure had simply changed, and structures that evolve gradually rarely return to their previous form, once the foundation beneath them has already moved. The conversation happened on a quiet Sunday morning. There had been no dramatic lead-up to it, no argument the night before, no sudden discovery forcing the issue into the open. Just a moment, when Daniel finally decided to ask the question he had been circling around for weeks. We were sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight filtering through the window above the sink. I was halfway through a cup of tea, and Daniel had just finished reading something on his phone. He set it down slowly. "Can I ask you something honestly?" he said. I looked up. You always can. He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Do you still feel the same about us as you used to? It was a thoughtful question, not an accusation. I appreciated that. And because of that, I answered him honestly. I feel differently, I said. Daniel didn't react immediately. He simply waited for me to continue. Differently how? He asked. I folded my hands around the cup, considering the best way to explain something that had unfolded slowly over the years. For a long time, I said, our marriage had a very clear structure. You moved forward in your career and ambitions. I made sure everything around that movement stayed stable. Daniel nodded slightly, listening. That arrangement worked, I continued. But I don't think either of us ever really examined it closely. He leaned back in his chair. I always thought you preferred it that way, he said. I probably did at the time, I replied calmly. But preferences can change when people start seeing things more clearly. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question I had expected eventually. Seeing what more clearly? I could have mentioned the emails, the conversations from the first year of our marriage. But surprisingly, they no longer felt like the most important part of the story, because what I had learned from them wasn't a secret that needed exposing. It was simply a perspective. I realized something about how we built our life, I said gently. Daniel watched me carefully. For many years, stability in our relationship came mostly from me, I continued. Not because you demanded it, but because I naturally filled that role. He didn't disagree. I think you're right about that, he admitted. I nodded. And recently I've been exploring what my life looks like when that stability isn't my only responsibility. Daniel absorbed that slowly. So you feel like you were holding everything together? He asked. I shook my head. No. I feel like I was holding myself in one place. The distinction mattered, because this wasn't about blaming him. It was about recognizing how roles evolve quietly over time. Daniel looked thoughtful, almost reflective. I didn't realize you felt that way, he said. I didn't realize it either, I replied. That answer seemed to settle something between us. Not completely, but enough that the conversation stayed calm. No raised voices, no dramatic declarations. Just two people sitting across from each other, acknowledging that the life they had built together was entering a different phase than the one they had started with. Eventually, Daniel asked one more question. What happens now? I smiled slightly. Now we figure out what our relationship looks like when both of us are fully participating in it. He nodded slowly. And for the first time in a long while, the silence between us didn't feel like something being avoided. It felt like space, the kind where a new chapter can begin, if both people are willing to read the story differently than they did before. If you had asked me 10 years ago who I was inside my marriage, I probably would have answered without much hesitation. I would have said I was Daniel's partner, his support system, the calm center that allowed the rest of our lives to function smoothly. And none of those descriptions would have been untrue, but they would have been incomplete. Because identities built around stability can quietly narrow over time. You begin to define yourself by how well things around you continue working, how little disruption you create, how consistently you hold the structure together. For many years, that role felt natural to me, not forced, just comfortable. But comfort has an interesting side effect. It can make you forget that your identity isn't supposed to remain fixed forever. People evolve. Not all at once. Not through dramatic reinventions. Just gradually, as awareness accumulates and priorities shift. The woman I am now isn't someone who rejected her past or regrets the years she spent building stability in our lives. Those years mattered. They created the foundation that allowed both Daniel and me to grow into who we are today. But I also understand something now that I didn't understand before. Stability is most meaningful when it exists alongside freedom. Freedom to move. Freedom to expand. Freedom to occupy space in your own life without quietly shrinking to maintain someone else's balance. Over the past year, my days have begun to reflect that understanding. My teaching work has grown more demanding in ways I genuinely enjoy. I've started contributing to a small academic publication that encourages deeper discussions about narrative and identity. I travel occasionally for conferences, something I once declined because it complicated Daniel's schedule. Now we coordinate our plans together, not because either of us is controlling the structure anymore, but because both of us exist equally within it. Daniel has adjusted as well. At first, the shift in our dynamic made him uncertain, not defensive, just unsure of how the new balance would function. But over time, I think he has begun to appreciate something he didn't fully recognize before. When stability doesn't come automatically from one person, both people become more conscious participants in maintaining it. Our conversations feel different now, more curious, less predictable. We ask each other questions instead of assuming the answers. Sometimes we disagree about things we once would have simply accepted. And strangely enough, those disagreements don't weaken the relationship. They make it more real. Because a partnership where both voices are present will always feel more dynamic than one built quietly around a single center. If someone met me today without knowing my history, they probably wouldn't see the version of Rowena that people once described as reliable, or the calm support behind the scenes. They would see a woman who speaks when she has something to say, who listens when someone else needs to be heard, and who understands that quiet strength isn't about disappearing into the background. It's about choosing when to step forward and when to observe, without losing yourself in either role. That balance took years to understand, but once you find it, you realize you are never invisible at all. You are simply waiting to occupy your own story fully. There's a strange expectation people carry about change. They imagine it arriving like a storm, loud, sudden, impossible to ignore. A moment where everything fractures, where decisions are made in dramatic bursts, and lives are split into clear before and after chapters. But the most meaningful changes rarely look like that. They arrive quietly. So quietly that sometimes you only recognize them after they've already reshaped the landscape of your life. If someone looked at Daniel and me today from the outside, they would probably see something very ordinary. Two people are sharing breakfast before work, a house that still carries the comfortable rhythm of routine, conversations about schedules, weekend plans, and the occasional argument about whose turn it is to deal with the overflowing laundry basket. Nothing about it appears revolutionary. And yet, the foundation underneath those ordinary moments is completely different from what it once was. Not because one of us forced the other to change, but because we both gradually stepped out of the invisible roles we had been performing for years. Daniel no longer assumes I will quietly absorb the emotional weight of our life together. And I no longer assume that maintaining peace requires silence. The difference isn't dramatic. It's subtle. But subtle shifts often create the most stable forms of balance. Sometimes people ask me whether our relationship has become stronger because of everything that changed. I usually pause before answering, not because the answer is complicated, but because strength isn't always the right word. Strength suggests resistance, something that survives pressure by refusing to break. What Daniel and I have now isn't about resistance. It's about awareness. We see each other more clearly than we used to, not through the comfortable assumptions that once defined our roles, but through the choices we continue making every day. And that clarity creates a different kind of connection, one that doesn't rely on someone disappearing to keep the structure intact. If there's a single lesson hidden inside my story, it's this. You don't need to fight for attention in your own life. You don't need dramatic confrontations to reclaim space inside a relationship. Most of the time, real change begins with something far simpler. A moment of awareness. A quiet decision to stop shrinking. And the patience to allow that decision to reshape everything around you, little by little. No grand declarations, no sudden revolutions, just a steady presence. That's the kind of power people often overlook. But it's also the kind that lasts. Because when someone finally occupies their own life fully, the balance around them adjusts naturally. Not loudly, not painfully, just steadily.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!